would like to say that, in fact, despite all the teaching experience, performing experience, composing experience, transcribing experience, I remain incredibly like the first time in front of a piece of music. Even if it's a piece I've known long time ago. And what I mean by there is that it doesn't erase the experience, but it opens the mind to other options in the interpretation. And being constantly in contact with students who discover the piece which I rediscover with them is very humbling, truly. It's not just a figure of speech. And in fact, just play the old way we think is the right way, because the tradition, our teachers, the way we established our awareness about what is the style of this composer, what is the perfect tempo for that piece, and what is the expectation of technique to approve and to improve until you can play this concerto or that sonata. Of course, the opinions are diverse, as one realizes that the same piece can mean so many things differently to so many people. And therefore I come to the fact that when I listen to a performer, colleague, younger colleague, student, in the case of students, when they trust you and they come for your advice, you owe them honesty. You don't owe them attitude about how you consider that you know because you've been around longer, let's say. I don't think it's a good argument enough, because there is no hierarchy in music. A child prodigy can play intuitively with the awareness of music of somebody who is an adult having studied it. It doesn't mean, even if it's tempting to consider it prodigious, that it is better or that it is more clever. It's just that the influx of intuition is stronger at a certain early age, when, since there is no but innate compared to learned, and then that if later, when the learned becomes more than the innate, well, that these balances of substances are difficult to calculate, estimate. But let's say that if both of the two elements, in case you add knowledge to the innate, at some point it becomes boiling point. And when you hear somebody play the piano, you guess by their involvement, by their connection with the music. Is it by the ear, by the fingers, by the soul, by the intuition? Is it just some kind of miraculous situation? But you don't really, as a listener, think, oh, let me think, is he gifted or is she gifted? Or knowledgeable or skillful? I think all those skills are accumulated because the intuition is the given departure, and then the studies, the learning, the satisfying the curiosity of the young student's intuition is there to complete, not to cap, nor to be considered unnecessary and say, hey, why do I need to learn when I already feel, hear, imagine, sense all that without putting words on them? It's true, you're born with a mother tongue, and you speak it without knowing even that you speak it, because in fact you speak it by repeating through the ear, and therefore you don't have to learn how to write it since you already speak it. You can express yourself perhaps with a limited vocabulary, but you can express yourself with the vocabulary that you heard. So it's an oral transmission, literally, like the non-written music, oral transmission in the folkloric sense of the word, the country music, where people play music without knowledge of notation, and they play it by receiving it from their ancestors or from traveling in places where they wanted to capture a certain musical culture which is not theirs and which is not written. And therefore, you realize that music, yes, it is a language, yes, it is an expression. In fact, it is a way to say what the words can't say. That's poetry, basically. You use words, but they don't always mean what they mean in the real meaning, in order to organize them in an order with a sound system of their resonance that is as important as what you want to suggest in their secondary meanings. So a poem is not prose, and inevitably speaking is not written. It's improvised, is just spoken without any other than what life is, spontaneity. You organize, you schedule, you plan, you wish, you hope, you think that you're in a good track to go to the aim that you set yourself, if you did, in order to make a better living or reach better professional or personal acceptance in society, and people respect you, or people need you for your knowledge or for your experience, or both. That's in piano interpretation sometimes a bit of a fuzzy, complicated situation, because it's not either or, it's probably a bit of both. But I find it fascinating when people consider that, yeah, what is music? I feel it, I hear it, I sense it. I don't need to explain it or to be explained to me. In other words, you don't have to learn how to write your mother tongue or to read it. You could, because you would like to express yourself better, with a larger vocabulary, with subtle innuendos, in order to express yourself in a way that your exchange with others becomes more meaningful, more convincing, or more convinced, depending. But words have meanings, words have powers, because they touch psychologically a point of misunderstanding in discussions or debates, or understanding or imposition when there is no debate and no exchange. I think that nobody plays the piano in order to enter in a debate with an audience or a jury or chosen teacher. You can challenge, and I think is healthy, as a matter of fact. And I don't know that all teachers accept that challenge, because they consider that students come to them to gather their experience. Therefore, it's a one-way direction of the know-how and knowledge, asymmetrical, that goes from the one who knows to the one who seeks to know. The problem is that the student, or the advantage rather, it's not a problem, is that the student often already knows. At least because already feels, hears in the sense of inner ear. And when they hear a piece of music, they vibrate to it and they respond by learning how to play it. if they go through the filter of the score, if they go through the filter of another performer who impresses them to the point to which they say, I like this piece, I would like to play it. To a certain extent, if they don't know the piece, perhaps in fact, they're more playing the piece because of the performer who inspired them, in fact, who made them like the piece. And do they make a difference between the performer and the piece when they don't know the piece? Perhaps not. They assume that, like in an actor who plays a role in a play or a theater, therefore in a film or a TV series, they embody a writing where the characters, like in the original concept of writing to make you travel in your imagination, is literature and novels and fiction. And the purchased score is like a purchased book. It is a passport to escapism. And this escapism is not only to forget your reality, well, in part, but also to make you travel in other dimensions, in other imaginations, perhaps fantasies. Ultimately, it is. And I think art forms develop that capacity in our imagination as humans, regardless of our talents, to bring closer the untold, the unexplainable, the something that you feel through your senses, a breeze, a sun ray, a smile, a gaze, and then more deeply intentions about connecting between humans. And how do they do that? Sensorially, intuitively, intellectually, emotionally, all of the above. And I think an interpretation in music is not just a recitation of a music through a score with a well-learned tradition and well-established know-how, and then well-practiced technique in order to be, without which of course you can't express yourself, but in order to be competitive with other people who can play it as well as you, perhaps a little faster, perhaps with a different phrasing, sub-phrasing, articulation, breathing, tempo, and then starts the inevitable, they don't play it as it's supposed to be. According to whom? Well, to me, because I know best and they don't know as well. And then it's sanctioned by a jury in a competition where, in fact, in order to compare, you make everybody be mostly alike in their presentation, individual tastes or capacities to develop different tastes, let less to have a spark, let less to have innovation that comes not from the desire to surprise or to be just original for the sake of it, but because it corresponds to how the music speaks to you. And if this same piece of music doesn't speak to the jury member or spoke to the jury member when they were younger, to the way a candidate, an auditioner, a competitor, a future student, people who are going through the circuit of becoming aware and make themselves be discovered by the people who are already in the circuit while the generations swirl without hierarchy. And that I mean it is because, in fact, the intensity of that drive, I not call it talent, is that it overtakes experience. Now, you can dislike it, you can be amazed, you can find that appalling or uncultivated, lacking education, very good raw material, or talent alone doesn't make it all. Tell that Schubert, tell that composers with a drive without education or quasi. Of course they learned from copying like Bach from other composers in order to learn because they didn't have a proper studies. And Schubert for good or bad, of his own choices, but also because of his drive, was not an educated musician in the terms of studying. But he learned from observing Beethoven, Mozart's music, Haydn in Vienna. It was like the Mecca of the day. And can we say that a fugue by Bach, which is by essence more intellectually complex, is more meaningful or better or driven by some kind of superior, for us, a superior admiration than a song by Schubert? Of course, it's incomparable. It's like comparing, is an egg better than a tomato? But we need both. We need all of them as musicians, because we are nourished by Haydn and Beethoven and Schumann and Chopin and Liszt and Ravel and Debussy and Rachmaninoff and Scriabin and all of these and way more. Of course, then we say, there's so many, I can't know them all, so I'm gonna just go into one niche. I'll play only music from 1880 to 1895. Well, making fun by saying such limitation in 15 years of music. But believe me, if you're a musicologist, let's say librarian style, in the best sense of the word, scholar, you can study a niche, and the niche gets deeper and deeper and deeper, and you realize how much more there is to it than what you thought there was, as always when you research something. And of course, you cannot have a lifetime span or financial capacities to extend your studies to your lifelong, because that would be idealized. But the reality is that the socioeconomic systems and the opportunities and the necessity to go through what we're supposed to have in a longer life, seasons of youth and adult, and then aged, and then very old or dead. And what I find in music so fascinating, since I was a child prodigy who never took myself for a superior to the others, and some do, because it's easy too, since some of the adults are mesmerized in front of the prodigy as a substantial replacement in a spur of a probably cultural in part, but also a lot DNA marveling. Somehow, we cannot explain why we're more sensitive to music, more sensitive to mechanics, more sensitive to mathematics, more sensitive to paintings, more sensitive to ballet, more sensitive to any different form of human science or expression that researches to understand better the planets, or understand better the soil, or understand better the ocean, or save this and compare that, and become activists because you build a belief, a strong system in which you want then to say, hey, I want this to be my, if not fight, my conviction, my I want to bring this to the highest point, because I think it's not enough the way it is considered by the people of today. Would be a Baroque music, a jazz style, or in classical music, different eras that are so many, and geographic, written by the Western culture of Europe, or oral tradition by most others. And they're all valuable. Of course they are. The point is not to hierarchize them or to consider them differently because they're more savant or more amateur. And there is no advantage of being a scholar compared to being a self-taught. It's just that it gives you access to different levels of the expression of humankind that left us and that give us still today amazing music, which becomes the soundtrack of our lives. I believe that, People don't have to analyze the piece they enjoy when they're not musicians by training. Even if they sing in a choir, perhaps they played in a band, or perhaps they never did any music by themselves, even individually, unless they were forced as children, as many, by parents who are ambitious for the good of their children, not specifically in music, but in judo and in other extra school activities, because first of all it structures their time and it organizes them to have an aim to prepare to become better, stronger, healthier, and at the same time, if they do theater, they develop the memory. If they play music, they develop the ear. If they have one at the beginning that is more intuitive or without, but it's a discipline of the soul. It's a discipline of the body. If you do ballet, judo, or any of these, where in fact you add an added value to your natural who you are. And so this added value goes later through education and higher education. And the more you can afford financially or intellectually to continue building knowledge, the more you become humble because you realize how little you know. The more you express yourself, the more you search for the words, the more you find that perhaps you don't find the right words about what you want to say. So you start imagining new words. That's exactly what Schoenberg did when he decided, after centuries of tonal system, he'll reorganize the order of the 12 chromatic notes of the 7 natural fifths in the music classical sense of what we call the circle of fifths, in tonality, harmony, organization of sounds, and decided to change the paradigm by really changing the alphabet and then creating his own alphabet. So of course, for those who don't know the alphabet, they can't even connect to it. It's like listening to a love poem in a language you don't understand. You don't even know it's about love. It's all in the intention and the sounds and the language and the culture. And the culture means cultivation. Cultivation means to learn in order to become more receptive to these beauties that you would not. And if not, because you only get receptive to what you can through your intellectual perception, in your language perception. So your filter funnel is all of our filter funnels are narrowing. Perhaps for a purpose that we cannot absorb everything. Our brain is perhaps not made to be able to process so much information, and then our national identity, our sportive identity, our desire to be part of this community, either because of our desires, our hopes, our dreams, our idealized society dream, our desire to change the world to a better world because we are appalled by the way things are run in this and their place. And of course, you want to do something while you're on earth, between the birth you didn't choose and the death you don't know when will come. So you're intense, you're driven, you're enthused, and you're perhaps inspiring when you're that, or perhaps you're exasperating for some others who think that you're too much of your involvement, and they say, yeah, it's fine, we know, it's okay, there are other things in life. And same way for interpretation, this is good, but there are so many others who do even better. And by now we have this and that, and the other ones from the past, they didn't know how to read the score, they didn't have the right edition, they didn't have so much interest, or perhaps they were not able to be driven by authenticity, and they had bad editions, but they still recorded, and today we can hear them. Beautiful inspiration. Rubinstein, Horowitz, Gieseking, Lipati, Michelangelo, Richter. All these pianists were not Henley pianists because they didn't exist when they were young. But what did they make out of the authenticity that they were searching for? They found it through their own curiosity and their own meeting with their own teachers in their own schools. So they developed a sense of authenticity by their own experience of the piece. Yes, and you can say, I love Rachmaninoff by, well, Rachmaninoff himself, that is a bad example, because of the composer being the pianist. But let's say Rubinstein for Chopin. And of course, the easy thing to say, oh, he's Polish, therefore he feels it better. But then, yes, Brendel feels better Beethoven because he's Austrian. That is perhaps intellectually possible to be true. And I don't know that it can be proven wrong, but I think that when music is a universal language that has coloristic specificities for each really culture of the world with their backgrounds, I think that while the people of the country of the composer are legitimate, the ones who are not illegitimate. That's why a Chinese plays Austrian music, a Belgian plays Taiwanese music. I don't know, just to say that yes, there is a cultural predisposition because you grow in a place where certain music is being really brought to be not only liked but revered. I mean, you can come from a place where nobody knows about this music because you're driven by your musical talent, hearing. Not perfect pitch, but it helps. It just shortens certain things about learning the theory, how to get to the point. But the point is that you cannot construct a whole life in music by playing by ear. That is great for the beginning and actually should remain a good percentage in the mix through life with studies, education, erudition. It doesn't give you superiority to be erudite. It just gives you the capacity to be even more humble in front of your art. But to some others, you might appear arrogant. But yourself, you feel like the more you become specialized in something, the least you know, the more you want to know. And the next volume they're going to write and the next treatise you will construct because you want to transmit, not directly perhaps, but even through time, to others what you have perceived from what you have studied. And I find that ultimately when I hear a pianist play, student or colleague, as I said earlier, it is strangely not always in the thematic material, in the gorgeous melody, in the capacity to bedazzle me with their technique of virtuosity, of velocity, but also technique of control of the touch, of singing, of the touch quality, of the signature of their phrasing, how they say the same sentence but in their own words, so to say, because it's a breathing, it's an re-articulating, it's a human individuality which in a way filters through the stylistic funnel knowledge of what it's supposed to be. But then again, it depends on the instrument, the acoustic, and the people's knowledge about what's supposed to be, because if not, it's constantly renewed. But it is truly not only in those thematic materials that are incredible, that justify, let's say, in a sonata formal organization, the piece, because the form is the shape of the intellectual writing of music. Therefore, it's a concision of the thoughts. It gives you the intensity of the essence rather than spreading for hours. It gives you all of that in few minutes or quarter hour or an hour. And it's sometimes difficult for musicians to even say how long the piece they play is, because every detail is so important, and when they play the whole piece it seems to be a lifetime of expression, which it is through the experience of humanity that it is translating, but in fact it's only, let's say, 12 or 13 minutes on you see on a recording, and you're like, is that so short? Because the absolute value of the piece, the scope of the piece is not 12 minutes. How can you say all that in 12 minutes? How can you, in more than only say, open worlds, horizons in 12 or 13 minutes, whatever. It's because it's written. And therefore, as Mozart used to say, supposedly, that he sketches in his mind, while Beethoven, for instance, sketched a lot, and we see how he went literally into a sculpture because of the sketches that we have to see and observe how he shaped the piece. And so we value also in Beethoven the process, because we identify with it. We also start raw with whatever we have as a talent, or if we don't. But doesn't matter when we try to be better through education, through learning a trade, through becoming good at what we can help the others with. And in other words, everybody is valuable by being. And then they add on top of it their added value, which is their profession or their know-how or their way to inspire us or help us. We all need of all. We need an actor as well as a plumber, as well as a pianist, as well as a philosopher, as well as but perhaps not all at the same time. And sometimes they can be at the same time. It's just that we need to think that we can be helped by others for what we can do ourselves. And most of it, what is important is not to have a self-esteem that is bigger than ourselves, considering that because some people think that what you do is right, good and well and perhaps great, possibly better than some others in their eyes, even if it's not, shouldn't be in your eyes. But let's say not everybody has true humility, and let's say humility is difficult to sustain psychologically on earth. Okay, let's go. Yeah, okay, accept. I let it be. I discover that a pianist playing the piece that I played plays it differently from me. And I'm not going to say it's less good because it's different from me. If I expect everybody to play like me, if I think that the me is the right and the others are the not right, then it's very limiting. Unfortunately, sometimes happens because it's a self-esteem situation, it's a lack of confidence situation, it's something that is not to do with music. Psychology is complex of inferiority compared to people who project complex of superiority. It's like the rich, the poor, the gifted, the non-gifted, the talented, the non-talented. And it all becomes a question about egalitarism, I was going to say in French, false cognate, by the idea that we're going to raise everybody to the same equality. Through education, yes. In order to give the opportunity to develop skills which inevitably then become help to others. But first by becoming better yourself, by being in your self-esteem of your growth. And when I hear in your trade growth, I mean, and of course, hopefully in your wealth for those who can. But the point is that jealousy comes in the human ways of interacting. Desire to have what you have, but they can't, and then there is a sense of it's not fair, or I also tried my best, and how come I didn't win this competition, and how come I wasn't. And that is part of the teaching, very importantly, besides the technique, which is essential for a pianist, without which you can't express your artistry. But beyond the artistry, the choices of your artistry, the ways to be in the musical society somebody who will be looked for and not only jealous or admired, because it's not a competition, or shouldn't be, about egos. So I'm smiling because I'm sure you know that it is a lot that. But even beyond all of that, what matters is that you give a meaning to your life, and by giving that meaning, you have a discipline that teaches you how to reach that meaning, and by doing so, you're inspirational to the others. For education or by jealousy, it can be on both sides. But that's not to do with music, it's a personality situation. And I don't think that we need to judge, nor do we need to characterize people by their ways. But I still think that when we all serve this muse that inspires us, the beauty of this music that brings us to universe, worlds, emotions, thoughts, expressions, subtleties of innuendos, intended musical expressions, it's amazing and beautiful and enticing, and possibly the drive for it becomes an obsession. People say she or he's passionate about it. Passion originally was the word for the pain of Christ, and his expression when going to the cross. So passion is today considered mostly something irrational, something you like more than you should, because you cannot not go to that. What it's almost like, yeah, it is considered to be obsessive, let's say, desire, expression that you're never satisfied, never thirsty. Your thirst is always more titillated by the musical fountain that comes out of the works that you discover, that you play, that you teach, that you organize, that you share, that playing or writing, at all levels. The fact of knowing about what drives you doesn't mean that the knowledge will replace or will better your value as a human being sharing what means to you. And if what you're sharing makes the others moved and reflecting on their own while they listen to you play the piano, for instance, it's a fair exchange. You give them daydream, acting as an actor. You give them reflection through a piece, even of a composer from centuries ago. And it's a different time. You need to nourish your mind, you nourish your soul, you nourish your body, you nourish your experience, you nourish your competitivity, you nourish your enticing desires. All these things are part of the human experience. And I think that being the teacher, I listen to these pianists, especially the students, and I realize that I can help them not how to love the piece more, because they somehow do already before I even started teaching them, for the purpose of being into learning these pieces of the repertoire of the instrument that is either the essential, either some to discover, to bring to light that is less, let's say, popular, to say the least, and there's so many. The forgotten composers. And their compositions mostly, beyond the authors, is the works. A ballade by Chopin, a sonata by Beethoven, a symphony by Brahms, a ballet by Tchaikovsky. You notice it's the piece. Then the author, who anyway at some point existed, but it's not necessarily present, other than in our imagination, in our thoughts when we study this composer's work, because we feel like somehow we dialogue with the person going into the details, just like you do when you read a novel or then you study it in a class of literature, and then you go into the details. When you learn how to write creative writing for, let's say, screenplays, it's the same thing for composition. Yeah, you feel, you hear, you can come up with a theme, an idea, and then what do you do after? Well, you develop it, you compose it. And if you don't want, you just improvise it and let everything flow freely. And in a way, it's like life itself, right? Life's life. It's just a captured moment of life. That's what a video is, a film is, when not edited like a home film. That's what we try to capture with the photography. In the past, people had to paint them to remember their ancestors, because if not, how would they? Music remains always a mystery to some, art form to most, an industry for those who are in it, and inevitably science for those who write about, but who don't play, or if they do both, it's rare. Ultimately, the beauty in teaching, I find, and that's very humbling because it's very, very meaningful, is to bring the two of the elements that you think are necessary to make the student become their own teacher before they teach others, which is to combine intuition with knowledge. And that is the hardest combination to find in balance. Too much of the one pushes you down, not enough of the other doesn't allow you to go through the glass roof of the I feel it, I hear it, but I don't know how to do it. And if you know more than you feel, then you might come up with things that are artificially uninteresting and unimportant, but could be present interesting scientific ways of looking at music, dissecting this sound or phrase, articulation, everything. And I don't think necessarily we need to have people who come up from different horizons with different ideas. And then when we study them, we compare them and we think about such composer's work, such musicologist said this, such performer played that way, such teacher wrote a book about how to play Mozart, how to think Schubert, how to organize the classical form, how to express the innuendos of romanticism in Chopin. Is it the harmonic progression? Is it melodic line? Is it the structure? Is it the way of the inflection of the articulation of the phrasing compared to the Baroque before the modern? And we look at them universally in a timeline because we have that luxury today compared to the past, because the documents are available on a click of a finger, but not the understanding of what all that they mean. You cannot sight read a manuscript unless you read ancient clefs, for instance. It's like reading hieroglyphs for Egyptology. And even if you can read them, do you know what they meant? How can you make the connection between the dots that are not explicit in the intonation, or perhaps in the notation, or perhaps in the suggestion of a score's element of expression? People write titles, people write expressions in different languages. Italian was fashionable because of opera in the 18th century, but then nationalistically, then composers into the early 20th century did write on the scores with their own language. And in a way it expresses subtleties that we have to learn as if we learn the foreign language, not to speak, but to understand their musical intent. Between Ravel writing in French and Schumann in German, we have difference. Of course, the Italian indications are very, very generalized. They sort of cover a lot of territory with a single word, but it leaves so much room between what is intended and what is suggested. And you wonder if the music speaks by itself so much, by what it by its notes put together, the way they're organized by the composer on the page, then you don't need to be explained by the text what it means. It's like, if it's tender, be tender. If it's driven, be wild. And if it's expressive of some kind of joy, be happy or jubilant. It's always as if there is always a subtext that explains what the music itself says. And so you have to find how to define the music by itself without to add to it the layers of what you read, of what you understood, plus what you feel. To a certain extent, we are all subjective, no matter how objective we want to be. Science is more objective than art, granted. But subjectivity is also taking and defending an opinion that is healthy. And that is also sometimes contradictory with the teacher's opinion. And students don't always have the capacity or the will or the character of the or the capacity intellectually to debate with their teachers. But what they do is that they listen to many more than before of the people who play the same piece than the teacher's opinion about tempo, phrasing, articulation, pedaling, sound, direction, line, phrasing, narration, because they hear it by others. And often I find as a teacher today, compared to when I was a student, I am in competition with the opinions of others who irrigate the drive of my students. And that's fine. I live in this world. And the more the merrier. Who can inspire, or who are inspirational, or who are giving a temporary boost to a student who feels like this gives them the desire to reach that level. It could be the same for an actor compared to a famous actor, could be for an aspiring writer compared to a great novelist. It's just normal. That's hierarchy. But hierarchy not imposed, but hierarchy by the respect for the other. And respect is very hard to I cannot teach them to love the piece. I cannot teach them to respect me. I cannot teach them to, I guess, as a teacher, show them that I take at heart their involvement in the piece. And I try to help them not to play it like me, hear it like me, think it like me, feel it like me, because if not, you would be wrong. But I bring them to play the best of what they hear in it. And then comes the detail which makes the difference. A good fingering brings a good section well. Then it gives you peace of mind for the next. So, in other words, at the technical level, you develop the artistic choices because you give a certain sense of know-how, how to better handle the details that create the whole. But the whole is up to them to build out of all what they receive from everybody around, that they choose to filter one way or the other. Those they admire but don't learn from because they don't teach. Those who teach them but that might not admire them because they are not the great artists who play on the great stages. It's different levels of necessity, of nourishment of their own desire to rise into the level of those whom they admire to become. I want to play Chopin like this, I want to play Brahms like that, but in fact you'll do it by like yourself. And in that sense, it's better. Even if in the hierarchy of the audition, juries, exams, competitions, you have to go through funnels and funnels of a likeness in order to become still considered for your originality. But if you're too original, if your spark is too much less, let's say, accepted by the general knowledge of people's acceptance of how to play the pieces, then you wouldn't be marginalized. So there is a question about emulation and personal involvement, and what does it mean to me, and how can I bring it out? That's why when I hear a pianist play, of course, I mostly admire and also teach how to play the transitions, how to play the bridges, how to play the sections in the music form where it's technically less driven, less emotional, less appealing, and as an unforgettable melody like a perfume, or unforgettable harmonic progression that drives you as if you feel it musically in you because it becomes the pulse or the rhythm or the combination of harmony and pulse and rhythm and melody. And you don't have to dissect it so much into different layers, but they are contributing factors. But in the miscellaneous sections, where you have a little transition that goes from one to the other, you can overdo it and then you have to restart the next theme, the pulse, the engine, the tempo. And that becomes unflowingly unnatural. I like the flow. I like the idea that music goes from one point to another and glides through until the end. It doesn't mean that it doesn't breathe and stop and stretch and reflect on itself, and the repeat signs are there for that, and the music itself needs, either by endearment or conviction, to develop a sense of repetitivity of the note, of the theme, of the material, of the section, of the structure, of the idea of organizing architecturally the piece. Within the form you have the essence. And what is the essence? It's the statements, the melody, the harmony, the leitmotif, the things. But then you have always these structural things that hold the structure, and some composers write them more subtly than others, but when you play you have to be more subtle than most, sorry. And that is what I try to teach, is those things that are not obviously seen. If they're not done subtly, the whole structure becomes heavy. People say, oh, God is boring. Sorry for this expression that is so unrefined, but it's what people think often, or students sometimes fear. If I play the repeat, will it be boring? I have to play differently, right? And this is philosophical, way more than musical, about how do we hear, how do we think, how do we organize our concentration length of structure. Oh my God, all this is so beautiful to share. It's meaningful rather than beautiful, but the music is beautiful. And I find that when I can help them organize these bridges to merge into the traffic of the next section, I find that the whole structure then floats better in the air, or in the structure of the environment. It's just architecture. But it is important because it gives then a coating to the soulful expression that is in the piece itself, regardless if it's music for music, or music imitating elements of nature, elements of psychology, elements of intensity of our human experience, drive, hope, despair, anxiety, dream, abandon, hope. All of this is in music. I speak of the music without lyrics because inevitably the lyrics drive the music. But when the music is without lyrics, it expresses even more universally these elements plus way more that cannot be all told in words. That's why they're in music notes. It's touching, moving, and fascinating to teach students who discover what you think you already know and you realize that you don't. And it makes you feel humble. Sometimes more. It makes you feel like they don't realize that you learn while teaching them. But I think it's marvelous when students succeed in a piece of music or in their career better than you, the teacher. It's marvelous. It should be marvelous. A student and a teacher, the teacher should be always driven by the fact that the student goes beyond what the student, the teacher, when a student was able to do. Not that you stop developing in music as a teacher after you were a student, but at some point the wheel is spinning. And then there is a kinship between the talent of a student and the drive of the teacher, and they can inspire each other. They can, it's a jubilant exchange. Isn't that beautiful? How many jubilant exchanges are there on earth? Political? No. Very rarely, unless some kind of transcendental personality convinces you beyond your own conviction. No, it's mostly about, of course, hierarchy, a boss and all, but to have such situation where, as I said, the teacher and the student serve the same piece and the same composer. And I find that for interpretation teachers to be essential. For composer teachers is different because you have to take in account all the inspirations of past composers that are filtered through you. You cannot just ignore them. And even if you do, they still speak through your subconscious. It's fantastic and humbling to teach students. And then teach the students of your students when they send them to you. I find that to be a beautiful, not only I find that, I'm sure everybody finds that, a beautiful lineage. It's like a chosen family. And at the same time, what connects you with that lineage is chosen values. How to respect music, how to respect the text, how to respect the style, how to respect the meaning, how to respect the student searching for that meaning. Am I supposed to? Not enough? Too much? Perhaps a little? What do you think? And you cannot only give them detailed answers like this, because they have to be part of a whole in which they insert their individual personality, their spark. And you should not shout it down by saying you're not right, you're not supposed to be like that. You can when you're convinced that they go in the wrong direction, because after all, there is a right and a wrong in our opinion. And that's right to be so, especially when they're young and you give them a certain strict, inevitable set of rules which they will break inevitably because they'll understand the purpose of them. Then they won't need them anymore, but without which they cannot do that. It's like you cannot build a building without a scaffolding. So, but then after that, if it's well built, it can eventually even stay beyond earthquakes or even changes of everything in technology and humanity, because it's based on universal, simple, but essential facts. And so there are laws of structure, there are laws for organizing the weights and the structures and the spaces and how they hold and how they're solid. This is science. And then it becomes artistic because the building that you build becomes an art form from scientific point of view. Not only for the technological aspect of it, the tallest building, the widest building, the oldest building. So when we play this composition, is not only because of the time period that it represents, but in which we, in a way, travel by imagination in a sort of a, time machine, but we are bringing it in our own time for our own audience, chamber music partners, students. It makes us part of a chain, of a group of musicians who came by, who felt, who emotionally expressed themselves better than others in what they perceived from nature, from their spiritual uplifting, their search for their necessity to understand beyond their finitude some meaning to things, and perhaps poetry in music gave them to understand a little bit or give them a solace from the misunderstanding of why this happens and how come this is allowed to be happening by humans or by nature, or both. All of them are by the nature, but we have inevitably as humans our own free will, and so their way we can play for the little level of music compared to all this philosophic statement about things of the universe. We're just playing one piece of music and we try to do it the best according to what's written in order to serve the muse through the composer's idea. And when we play the piece, it appears ephemerally during a few minutes, perhaps 7, 12, 40, 50, I don't know. But it seems lifetime in all these minutes, that of the experience, the emotion of what the composer through the music has expressed of their humanity. And I find that to be the most touching. Because ultimately a human teaches a human about what a human wrote. In words, in music, or meaning philosophically things, or spiritually things, or nature-wise things. And it's so inspirational to be close to these several levels of circles of time periods and depth of understanding and specifics of interpretation or performance, and how to organize this in order to give the student the capacity to blossom their own expression, their own experience, which is, you are in a way as a teacher the scaffolding of the student's own growth. Ultimately, it's a question of time and investment. It is not something that everybody who is gifted for music, or who has this drive or this desire of this calling that they feel they do, or their entourage does, have the opportunity to develop as a full-grown musician. Very early, the competitivity comes in play. And when there is a natural fitness for a certain trade, let's say the piano, then they teach the students how to play the piano, not how to understand the harmonic procedures, the grammar, the expression, the understanding of the analytical formal situation, which can be parallel to their learning of the industry of playing, the practicing of technique in terms of velocity, equalizing uneven fingers, and organizing a capacity to have the fingers fit exactly on the keys that they should be and not on the wrong ones. And so that is something which I find is the major trouble, is that in order to gain quick access to competitivity among very young already musicians through a trade that is their instrument, they play the instrument and that plays music. They play in an orchestra, but they play an individual part. They play in chamber music, but they know their part. So the capacity of participating in a group of music making where each is aware of what the others do demands long preparation. Of course, it depends very much of the time one has to grow the musical plant very fast, to be immediately very effective and win competitions, and therefore establish a name. And then somehow the interpretational culture comes later with a musical understanding of the harmonic progression, of the bass line, of the tonalities, of the modalities, of the modulations, of the cadences, of the punctuations, of the way the music, besides its expressive emotional evidence for those who are musical, has to be told with words on all these intuitions. Once you put words on the intuitions, then you can keep the intuition, but with the wording of what you go through in the texture, in the style, genre, time period of music, you become so much more, let's say, free from worries about memory slip, stage fright, because you feel solidly knowing the grammar of the language which you speak. Not only phonetically, as we spoke earlier, but also because of the written vocabulary, the written ways of learning about stylistic expression, how you can refine your expression and not just reproduce, repeat, or recite what the publisher published and the teacher enforces, and the competitors compete. And if it is the same ballade, the same etude, the same piece that is common expectation at high level or at whichever level of competition, the time is devoted to practice the mechanics, not the semantics, not to understand the meaning of what you play, but play it giving that illusion, and sometimes even told by some people who lack personal depth, when they say, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you don't know how to call this chord. It doesn't matter that you don't know in which key tonality you are in real time when you play, sight read, or perform. As long as you know it, you feel it. Therefore, you don't need to name it. Well, that doesn't work like that because that limits the growth and the possibility. The intuition, the talent goes only so far. And at some point, the student realizes that they're missing something in the group of knowledge that will bring them to the next level of their interpretational hope. And that's when you try to catch up with harmonic progressions, with keyboard harmony, with cadences, with dictations, with ear training, to capacity not only to train the ear but the brain to apply in real time when you play the piano what you learn separately, eventually in theory, but is written, because you have the time to think about it and write your assigned exercise. But when you have to apply it in real time in your trade, be it as a pianist, you have to be able to know in which key you are, in which key you're going, what is the general dynamic range according to what is the harmonic progression tempo, not just the tempo of the fingers notes. And if you have an acceleration of the harmonic progression from by bar to by beat, then you have an accelerando that comes also from the very texture of the piece and not only from the indications which are on top of the already assigned tempo. And the inventivity, the creativity was part of the Baroque learning, whenever the part of the modern learning is the alikeness and everybody reciting the same score in order to be judged, let's say, by the lower denominator, which is without the personal involvement in what the piece means to you, because if it does and it doesn't correspond to what the norm's supposed to be, then you're in trouble. So as a teacher, I have to find the right balance between driving the students to exponentially expand their horizons while also be competitive so they can be successful in their professional life. And of course, there is time for eccentricities, there is time for rigorousness, and there is time for developing your opinion about what you do or what you play or what you hear, and therefore how you heard it is how you played it, how you read it is how you understood it, how you deciphered the different levels of these incredibly rich textures of the piano playing. And then your harmonic pedaling, your melodic pedaling, the phrasing, the need for breathing. But all these things have to be coming from the ground up. In the Baroque music, it was written on the bass line with numbers or without, the basso continuo, and the melody was the emanation of the bass line with a chordal which call it continuo because of the continuous bass line with harmonizations, intuitive or numbered, so that they guide you towards which chord to place, but then how to organize the voice leading between these chords is also important. And this is an art which is separate from the time of the 19th century Romanticism, where the melody is the main driver, and then that emanates a harmony which is inevitably having a bass line. So in a way, the music of the Romantic era is really written up-down whenever the Baroque music is conceived down-up. And most of the time you should sandwich the two by having a bass line and a melodic line and the harmonic texture, arpeggiated, chordal, whichever, in the middle. And well, you don't compose the piece, it's already composed. But you can detect in the piece the layers, the voicing, the hearing, the flow and the following and of the flow of the elements. Just like in a string quartet, but observing the four parts. And not just playing one and not knowing what the others do. And I find that that is the key to it, is the time to grow and develop a wholesome musician who has a trade for an instrument, but who is also knowledgeable in theory, not to become a theorist, knowledgeable in composition, not to become a composer, but knowledgeable in the formal aspect of the construction of the piece the student is playing. And then this way, the piece reveals itself to you like as it talks to you, and you talk to it back through the instrument, or in your mind by just reading the music on the table, and perhaps playing one and singing another of the elements until you immerse yourself in the texture. Of course, all these things are easy for me to say because I have been privileged since a child to be bathing in a nuclear pool of music, in its grammar, in its dictations, in its harmonizations, contrapuntal, fugal, voices in motets, voice leading in quartets, and all this nourishes the voice leading in piano pieces, which are evocative of arias or evocative of quartet or evocative of orchestra. In other words, you develop your palette of curiosity through this incredible capacity to translate on the piano so many parts at the same time. Can't play a fugue on the oboe, but you can play a fugue on the piano by following the 4, 5, or 3 or whatever parts. And not just playing here and there and outlining and then going through another little bridge, which we call episode, and then go to the next. It's like an obstacles course. That's very, very, very good, but very, very, very limiting. There's a much more ongoing in the interaction between the voices in a fugue, between the contra subject and the answer, than just the entrances. It's the combinations of the voices in their flow, in their independence of melodic gestures, as well as eventually in their rhythmicity. So it's not one element or another, but it's the time to take when you're young and learning the trade, to be taught also very much the grammar of music. So that when you grow up and play more difficult pieces, while you can search to find with a teacher how to handle them technically, you should be able by then, by yourself, to figure out in which key I am, what is the rapport of this tonality, what are the types of affects, are they suspensions, appoggiaturas, accacciaturas, or is it trills, mordents, grace notes? How do I people all these elements in the specific, according to my conviction from the teacher and others, of how the piece is supposed to be. When Bach wrote inventions in terms of pedagogical ways, was more like templates for the students to invent their own inventions when they played for him. That is not to just play the score and recite it. It's also to understand why those rules of writing lead to this liberation of the voice leading that brings them to live in a beautiful and, I would say, utopical, perhaps, co-living, I was going to say, of the parts don't exist by themselves. They exist because the way they interact with each other. And so it becomes an idealized society of equals. And when you play a melodic line of the ballade by Chopin, do, fa, mi, si, re, do, re, mi, fa, do, mi, re, si. Okay, that is what everybody hears. But you have a bass note, harmonization with two groups of intervals in the 6/8, 8/9, 12/8. What happens in this is that you separate the melody from the accompaniment, the bass line from the harmonization, basically two hands in the left that have to be doing two functions, the melody either alone or then combined with other voices, secondary voices in the same hand. It's like a blossoming, flourishing texture. And the rests are as expressive as the notes, and the chosen dissonance for the chosen consonants, and the chosen rest for the chosen length of sound, for the chosen rhythmic harmonization compared to another one according to the mood, the situation. So much more that when you read the score and you try to fit it on your fingers, you already receive more information because you can gather it by observing, just like you observe anything that is interesting to you. How many bars are one structure of phrasing? What is the desire to connect to the next phrase by a bridge, or just we have a breathing and a closing of the tension from the release? Those things can be done intuitively without searching for them or naming them, without organizing them in one's thought, and just play as it comes, because it comes very naturally. for those for whom music speaks beyond this explanation that comes later. So I don't say that the education and the learning aspects overwhelm the innate intuitive talent. I just say, you know, it's the role of the teacher to balance the two. Because this is the way that you really respect and the student and the text that the students play. It's not just enough to say, play what is written, Daniel's right. That is the basic obvious, but you have to be able to understand, in your opinion, why this composer used this device to go to this section. And if you can't answer yourself the question and the teachers don't answer, it doesn't matter, because the more you play, the more you reflect and you think, the more you have an exchange, intimate exchange between the creative, of course, long time ago for the dead composer's process, and you who are recreating it, coming later in generations after it was written or performed and heard and liked. So it's your turn to be in front of it, to reflect it for the audience. I find that when one gives the time to time, one rises well more rounded musicians, regardless of their trade and of their virtuosity. It's not instead, it's as well. And it should be taught at the get-go. Because if not, the trade becomes prominent and the knowledge of what you do less, to the point to which the gap is unsurmountable. When you're a young child, you don't know very well what you're doing, you do what you're told, and if you have the musical ear, it guides you to go through even more complexities without to be explained. But that lasts only a time. There is a moment it evaporates, that talent evaporates. And then it's not replaced by knowledge per se, like equal for equal. It's more like it solidifies your curiosity to understand by yourself better newer musical languages, newer musical pieces that you can learn, of course, with the help of a teacher, but that you can be in dialogue with the composer's thoughts while learning it in order to understand it for your way of understanding that might not even be necessarily the right one, but one that allows you to connect to the piece beyond only I like it, it sounds good, it's driven, or it's thoughtful, it's happy, it's sad. Obviously, it's part of these things, but it is in fact very important to respect the student by giving them the opportunity to, in fact, develop and blossom and have their own garden after the seeds of the teacher become their own creation later. And they don't have to accept, they can even reject what they were taught. And that is somehow in the filiation very not unusual. But in order to create yourself out of what you are supposed to be, perhaps imitating, perhaps mimicking for a certain time, not that I encourage that, but as a teacher, I mean, but nevertheless, it allows you to start living the piece, not only as a bundle of sections with details to play cleanly, but beyond, because of that already, addressed by the technical aspects of the control of the touch and the fingerings and the tensions of the wrists compared to the tendons, and in other words, the independence of fingers and voicing through the fingers, different type of weights on each key. All these nourish each other. And of course, it might take longer than the time to be winner of a competition in the teens. But what will happen after? The majority don't win the competitions. And when they reach a certain age of 30-some, when most competitions for piano have this deadline after which you're too old to compete, and if you've only spent, let's say, 15 years of your life from teenager to this to compete in order to be recognized and somehow dream of this career that you admire in others, It's like working only on playing the lottery instead of educating yourself. You should do both. There's nothing wrong with it, except that when you don't win a competition, which is the aim, even if it's an aim to provide energy and drive to practice towards it, then you have to find a meaningful aim in your repertoire, in your collaborative repertoire with singers, with instrumentalists, with chamber music, that is not only the solo as you studied, the sonatas, the concerti, but also. And find there's the purpose of your life for the next 30 or 40 years after 30, or more, hopefully, where you will still revisit pieces of your youth, but you will discover new. You will enter in new ways of hearing, understanding the music and its language. Different composers reveal themselves at different points of one's life. When Ravel met Gershwin, and Gershwin asked to become a symphonic composer like him, he wrote to Mademoiselle Boulanger, as they were old schoolmates in Forest class, he confided to her that he's worried that if he brings Gershwin what he thinks he's missing, which at the time was a young Gershwin, already successful on Broadway. He was so aware of that talent, that inspiration, that spontaneous inner world coming out, that he said we might lose in him the natural jazz, let's say, for that purpose of genre expression. And so if a Ravel can be as respectful, and my teacher also, for the different type of musicianship of students who came to her, intuitive, folkloric, intellectual, theoretical, musical, pianistic, any other instrumental. It was not just an instrument, it wasn't just music theory for the sake of theory. It was analysis of the elements together with philosophy, poetry, and a certain distance of understanding commonalities between time periods that are in different stylistic eras. And then also define their differences. It was building a cultivated musician as well as a virtuoso musician, not instead. Of course, it depends on the tenacity and the drive of the student, because it's easy to get discouraged by the competition as well as by one's own realization that what one needs to know is an ocean and that one has a spoon. So it feels like hopeless. But in a way, music is enticing the soul, it's enticing the drive to play the beautiful piece, to be close to it by playing it. It means the world to a musician. Of course, they can listen to others play it, and that is also very beautiful, if not very meaningful or very satisfactory. But to be able to play, okay, it needs years of training, literally training the technique. But you can't leave and you shouldn't at least, leave the theory at the midget size and the playing at the highest level. Because at some point it needs to nourish itself from the musical understanding. Not because you do, that's not because you understand the piece that you played better. It's just that you feel more comfortable in what you are working with, and how you can better yourself to go from point A to point B to point C to point D in the piece and create the structure that is there already, but you bring it alive when you play it. I find that to be the most important thing, because Mademoiselle Boulanger told me that I received a gift from God about music, and she told me your duty all your life long will be to transmit it to others. Wow! I didn't ask for it when I was a child, I thought, that gift. And she thought that I should be brought on the edge of the guilt trip for not, for sure, using the talent that I was supposedly gifted by God for me to self-use for my own financial or fame narcissism. It was all about humility, serve the music by serving the musicians. I think she found that equation in her own life as a teacher. Perhaps also because of things that she put on a second, on this back burner, her own conducting, her own performing, her own music making, compared to conferences, lessons, classes, teaching, structurizing this and enticing that in different students by sensing what is individually what drives them. And of course, you see students when they come already to a certain extent with a musical baggage, and then you try to bring them to the next let's say, stop where they'll go to another place to learn how to develop more this baggage. And I find that if we had to grow a student in music from childhood by intuition to adult with knowledge, through all these different elements that should be not separated like skeleton and coating, or it has to be all together. The understanding with the interpretation, they're almost a sequence of events. They're not just patched elements on the music by the score of the teacher, because they will not be believable by those who hear you. Even if you're right, you have to be convinced. It has to become a statement which you say, I play this piece. Not that it's my sonata by Beethoven, but I play this sonata. It doesn't mean better or worse than others, and I should never or I should always. Those are, I think, unnecessary skirmishes. I think it has to be deeply humble to say, this is representing philosophically, in the piece that I play, a well without bottom. And the more I dig, the more I find beauties that I haven't noticed the first time through, or the second time through. And that keeps you humble because of what you face in quality and quantity of repertoires before you. As well as it keeps you humble compared to the people who use with their trade at great advantage their musical talent only for themselves. And of course, students love to admire them, but they they go to be taught, by teachers who are not those like stars of Hollywood or famous actors. And I don't think that those who perform only and don't teach do it because they can't. It's because they're building their own self. In fact, they're teaching themselves through their career. They're replaying the same pieces better, differently, deeper. And it is, they don't have to word it. It happens within themselves, and they listen to recordings and they better themselves. And so they become these incredible performers who inspire the students who go to study with a teacher who is not one of these. And I think the student pretty quickly understands that there is a necessity for the two, the learning and the being, the innate and the mastered by knowledge. Understanding won't make you play better, but it'll make you more aware of where and how you can improve the piece for your own, in fact, elevation towards it. If we only could have the hearing of the composers imagining the masterpieces we play, nothing but 10% perhaps, to give a number, of what they heard and what we can bring out from the text for the audience of what we heard of what they heard through the reading and through the imitation of other performing. I cannot say that it's possible to divide the two separately because it's part of life. Compare, contrast, self-esteem, build up, accept to be contradicted, accept that you could have been perhaps wrong for a tempo choosing, a phrasing there, a pedaling that or there. And every time you go through it again, you rethink it. It's not like you're replaying it forever in the same way. First of all, it's impossible. But second of all, you build up certain bases which are solid, but then on the top, you can have room for changes in tempo, phrasing, rubato, how much, not too much, not at all, pedal, harmonic or not so much. I mean, all these things come as a consequence of your understanding of the text, and nobody's going to sit next to you to spoon feed you the text. And if they do, they don't respect you as a student, because they have to give you the tools to do it by yourself, no matter how long it will take, because that's only when you will be truly yourself expressing the piece and not reciting the piece, while playing it as, it's not contradictory, as precisely as possible according to the publisher that you trust. Because there is, at some point, the word trust between the teacher and the student in the two directions, and between the publisher, therefore musicology scholar, and the student who prefers this or that edition because it's clearer or better explained or brings some answers. But so you have some solids plus technique, organization of practicing, how to practice, how often to practice, how to organize the muscular memory. It's about trade. I wish to all gifted young people to find the environment where people will not search for short-term return on investment, because a human being is complex. It's not just a brain, it's a psyche. It's not just a psyche, it's doubt, it's a body that can be ill, it's a body that can be strengthened, it's functions of the hand that have to be developed in a careful way so they don't hurt on the way. You acquire these step by step. You don't run the marathon the first day you start running. And same way, it's not just a series of sprint runnings that makes a marathon on the piano. It's playing a piece for the meaning of the piece through you. Granted, the margin is less than if you compose the piece, but then it's a different point of view, because if you compose the piece, does it mean that your composition equals the best interpretation? No, I believe not. I believe interpretation is a revisitation of a beloved text. And it has to mean so much to you in order for you to be convincing to the others with that text. Oh, they know it's not yours, and you know it's not yours, but you don't pretend it's yours. You just immerse yourself in the piece, in what it is, like on the tracks of the piece, and it brings you from valleys to high mountains, or to... It's a journey. It's a marvelous journey.